December 1945. The transport ship SS Marine Lynx cut through the cold waters of the Pacific, carrying an unusual cargo bound for the American heartland. Below deck, 372 Japanese women huddled together in converted quarters, their faces masks of controlled terror. They had been told they were being relocated to a prisoner facility in a place called Arkansas, but every woman aboard knew what truly awaited them. After years of propaganda about American brutality, after months of preparing for an honorable end rather than capture, they were certain this journey would end in systematic elimination. What none of them could possibly imagine was that their arrival in rural America would shatter every belief they held, transform their understanding of their enemy, and create one of the most remarkable and little-known stories of reconciliation in the entire conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The journey from the Pacific Islands to Arkansas took 17 days, and during that time, the women prepared themselves mentally for what they believed was inevitable. They were not soldiers, but they had served the Japanese military machine as nurses, administrative staff, and support personnel across the occupied territories. Now, with their homeland facing imminent invasion and their military defeated, they found themselves in enemy hands, convinced that American revenge would be swift and merciless. Among them was Miyako Tanaka, a 24-year-old nurse from Osaka who had spent 3 years tending to wounded soldiers in field hospitals across the Pacific. She kept a small journal hidden in her belongings, writing in tiny characters to conserve the precious paper. Her entries from the voyage reveal the collective mindset aboard that ship. She wrote that the women had discussed how they might face their end with dignity, how they might support each other in their final moments, and how they should maintain the honor of their families even in defeat. Also aboard was Keiko Yamamoto, 31 years old, who had worked as a translator and administrative coordinator. She spoke some English, having studied it before the conflict, and this made her both valuable and dangerous in the eyes of her fellow prisoners. Some worried she might be used against them. Others hoped she could discern the Americans' true intentions before it was too late. She wrote later that she spent the entire voyage listening to conversations among the guards, trying to detect hints of what awaited them, but finding only casual discussions about baseball, families back home, and complaints about the food. The third woman who would become central to this story was Haruko Sato, a quiet 42-year-old widow who had served as a medical administrator. She had lost her husband and 2 sons in the conflict, and she carried a grief so profound that she barely spoke during the entire journey. Other women later recalled that Haruko seemed almost eager for whatever end awaited them, as if reuniting with her lost family would be a mercy rather than a punishment. The SS Marine Lynx docked in San Francisco on a grey morning in late December. The women were transferred to a train, their windows covered, denied even the curiosity of seeing the American landscape they had been taught to hate. The train journey took 4 days, moving steadily eastward through mountains and plains they could only imagine. The guards who accompanied them were professional but distant, offering no clues about their destination or fate. When the train finally stopped and the women were ordered out, they found themselves in a landscape utterly foreign to their experience. Arkansas in winter was nothing like the tropical islands or the coastal regions of Japan they knew. The air was cold and damp, the sky a flat gray that promised rain. Bare trees stretched across rolling hills, and the camp itself looked like a collection of simple wooden buildings surrounded by wire fencing. It was called the Jerome Relocation Center, and it had a history the Japanese women knew nothing about. What they did not know was that this facility had previously housed Japanese Americans, citizens of the United States who had been forcibly relocated from the West Coast in one of America's own dark chapters of the conflict. Now repurposed as a prisoner facility, it stood as a strange intersection of ironies that neither the captors nor the captured fully appreciated at the time. The women were processed in groups of 20. They stood in lines, shivering in their inadequate clothing, waiting for what they were certain would be the beginning of systematic abuse. Instead, they were issued thick blankets, winter coats, and sturdy boots. Miyako wrote in her journal that night that this confused everyone. Why provide warm clothing to people you intended to eliminate? Some women theorized it was to keep them healthy enough for forced labor. Others suggested it was a trick to lower their guard before the real cruelty began. Then came the showers. The camp administrator, a Captain Robert Harrison from Little Rock, Arkansas, had ordered that all incoming prisoners be given the opportunity to bathe after their long journey. The facilities were simple but functional, with hot water systems installed during the camp's previous use. When the Japanese women were told they would be required to shower, a wave of panic swept through the group. This was it, they thought. This was how it would happen. They had heard stories, whispered rumors about facilities disguised as shower rooms where prisoners were eliminated en masse. The women clutched at each other, some beginning to pray, others trying to maintain stoic composure. Miyako wrote that her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her pen that night as she recorded the day's events. Keiko, with her English skills, was ordered to translate the instructions. She stood before her fellow prisoners and had to find the words to tell them they were being ordered into the shower facilities. She could see the terror in their eyes, the way some women gripped the hands of friends, the way Haruko simply closed her eyes and seemed to accept what was coming. Keiko's voice trembled as she translated, though later she would say she tried to keep her tone neutral, professional, as if they were simply discussing a routine matter. The first group of 20 women was led into the shower building. They undressed in silence, each woman lost in her own thoughts, her own fears, her own prayers. The room had multiple shower heads along 2 walls, simple fixtures that looked exactly like what they claimed to be, but the women had been conditioned not to trust appearances. They stood under the shower heads waiting. An American female nurse, Second Lieutenant Mary O'Brien from Chicago, turned on the water. Hot water. Actually hot water. Not scalding, not freezing, not mixed with chemicals or anything else. Just clean hot water that steamed in the cold air and cascaded over bodies that had not felt such simple luxury in years. The women stood in shocked silence as the water washed over them, as the accumulated grime and sweat of weeks of travel began to dissolve, as the warmth penetrated their cold skin. Miyako was in that first group. She wrote that night that she stood under that showerhead for a full minute before she could even process what was happening. The water just kept coming, hot and clean and endless. No one shouted at them to hurry. No one threatened them. The American nurse simply provided soap and towels and spoke in a gentle voice that Keiko translated with increasing bewilderment. When the first group emerged, wrapped in towels, their skin pink from the hot water, their hair clean for the first time in months, the waiting women bombarded them with questions. What happened? What did they do to you? Are you hurt? The answers made no sense. They just let us bathe, with hot water and soap. Real soap, not the harsh substitute they had grown accustomed to, as much hot water as we needed. The second group went in with slightly less terror, but no less confusion. Then the third. By the time all 372 women had been through the showers, a new kind of fear had settled over the camp. This was too strange, too unexpected. What were the Americans planning? Why this pretense of care? When would the other shoe drop? Captain Harrison, observing the confusion among his prisoners, asked Keiko to gather the women so he could address them. Through Keiko's translation, he explained the basic rules of the camp. They would be housed in barracks, 6 women to a room. They would receive 3 meals a day. They would be expected to maintain their living quarters and could volunteer for various work assignments. And yes, they could shower daily if they wished, with hot water available at scheduled times. The women listened in silence, their faces revealing nothing but their minds racing. Haruko spoke for the first time since arriving, asking a question through Keiko. Why are you doing this? Why are you treating us this way? Captain Harrison, a man who had seen enough of the conflict to be weary of hatred, answered simply, because you are human beings, and this is how human beings should be treated, even in a prisoner facility. The women did not believe him. For the first week, hardly anyone showered. The facilities were available, the hot water running on schedule, but the women stayed away. They could not shake the conviction that this was an elaborate psychological trick, that accepting this comfort would somehow make them vulnerable to worse treatment later. They whispered theories in their barracks late at night. Perhaps the Americans were studying them, learning their weaknesses. Perhaps the kindness was designed to break their spirit more effectively than outright cruelty would. Perhaps the hot showers were a test, and those who indulged would be singled out for punishment. Miyako wrote extensively about this period. She described how the women formed informal committees to discuss their situation, how they tried to make sense of their captors' behavior through the lens of everything they had been taught. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They had spent years being told that Americans were barbaric, that surrender meant torture and humiliation, that the enemy was fundamentally cruel and untrustworthy. Yet here they were, being offered hot showers and warm clothing and regular meals. The food was another source of confusion. The camp kitchen served simple American fare, unfamiliar and often bland to Japanese palates, but it was substantial and regular. Breakfast meant oatmeal or eggs, bread with butter, coffee or milk. Lunch brought sandwiches and soup. Dinner featured meat, potatoes, vegetables, and always fresh bread. For women who had been on military rations for years, who had watched food supplies dwindle as their military situation deteriorated, the sheer abundance was staggering. Keiko found herself in an increasingly important role. As the primary translator, she became a bridge between the American administration and the Japanese prisoners. Captain Harrison quickly recognized her value and began meeting with her regularly to discuss the camp's operation and to address the women's concerns. Through these conversations, Keiko began to see her captors as individuals rather than as a monolithic enemy. Lieutenant O'Brien, the nurse, made it her personal mission to help the women adjust. She could see the fear in their eyes, the way they flinched at sudden movements, the careful distance they maintained from American personnel. She started spending time in the common areas, not doing anything official, just being present, letting the women grow accustomed to her. She learned to bow slightly in greeting, a gesture that surprised the Japanese women. She smiled often and moved slowly, projecting calm and safety. It was Haruko who finally broke the shower boycott. On the 8th day, she simply walked into the shower building alone during an evening period when no one else was there. Lieutenant O'Brien was on duty and watched as the older woman undressed with the careful dignity of someone who no longer cared about the consequences of her choices. Haruko stood under the water for 20 minutes, her eyes closed, tears mixing with the shower spray. When she emerged, Lieutenant O'Brien was waiting with a warm towel. Through gestures and simple words that transcended language barriers, the nurse conveyed something that Haruko had not felt in years: compassion. No judgment, no mockery, no cruelty. Just one woman helping another. Haruko returned to her barracks and told her roommates simply, "The water is really just water. It is really hot, it is really clean, you should go." The boycott crumbled after that. Within 3 days, the shower schedule was fully utilized. Women who had not felt truly clean in years discovered the simple pleasure of hot water and soap. They began to stay longer, to appreciate the warmth, to allow themselves this one comfort, even as they remained wary of everything else. Miyako's journal entries from this period reveal a fascinating internal struggle. She described the guilt she felt for enjoying the showers, as if finding comfort in captivity was a betrayal of her country and her fallen comrades. She wrote about the confusion of receiving kindness from people she had been taught to hate, and she documented the gradual shift in the camp's atmosphere as the women began, slowly and reluctantly, to accept that their treatment might be genuine rather than a complex trick. The winter deepened and the camp settled into routines. The women were not required to work, but they were offered the option to volunteer for various tasks. Some helped in the kitchen, curious to learn about American cooking. Others worked in the camp's small garden, preparing beds for spring planting. A few, including Keiko, assisted with administrative tasks, translating documents and helping to organize the camp's operations. Captain Harrison made a point of walking through the camp daily, greeting the women with respect, asking through Keiko if they needed anything. He ensured that medical care was available, that letters could be sent to families in Japan through Red Cross channels, that religious observances were accommodated. He treated the facility not as a punishment camp, but as temporary housing for people caught on the wrong side of history. This approach was not universally popular among his own staff. Some American soldiers who had fought in the Pacific, who had lost friends to Japanese forces, struggled to treat these women with the kindness Harrison demanded. But Harrison was firm. "This is not about what they did or what their country did," he told his staff. "This is about who we are and who we choose to be." The true transformation began in early February, when Lieutenant O'Brien organized a small birthday celebration for one of the prisoners, a young woman named Akiko who was turning 20. She had mentioned the date to Keiko in passing, not expecting anything to come of it, but O'Brien remembered. She baked a simple cake using kitchen supplies and organized a small gathering in the common room. When Akiko was presented with the cake, lit candles and all, she burst into tears. The other women stood in shocked silence. This level of individual attention, this acknowledgement of personhood, was so unexpected that no one knew how to react. Akiko tried to refuse the attention, embarrassed and overwhelmed, but O'Brien simply smiled and encouraged her to blow out the candles. That night, Miyako wrote, "They know our names, they remember our birthdays, they see us as people. What kind of enemy does this?" The question haunted the camp. In the barracks, late at night, the women began to discuss not just their current situation, but everything they had been taught about the conflict, about their enemies, about the world. If the Americans were not the monsters they had been told to expect, what else might have been lies? If kindness could exist even in a prisoner facility, what did that mean about the nature of the conflict they had served? Keiko found herself in increasingly philosophical discussions with Captain Harrison. He lent her books from his personal collection, including American literature and history. She, in turn, helped him understand Japanese culture and the mindset of his prisoners. These conversations went far beyond the practical needs of running the camp. They were two people from opposite sides of a global conflict, trying to understand each other as human beings. One evening in late February, Harrison asked Keiko a direct question. "Why did you think we would hurt you? What exactly did you expect?" Keiko considered carefully before answering. She explained the propaganda they had received, the stories of American brutality, the instructions that surrender was worse than death. She described how every woman on that transport ship had believed they were sailing toward systematic elimination, and she told him about the showers, about how every single woman had believed they were being led to their deaths when they were ordered to bathe. Harrison was visibly shaken. The idea that these women had spent even a single moment believing he intended to harm them, that his simple orders about hygiene had caused such terror, clearly disturbed him deeply. He was quiet for a long moment before saying, "We may have been enemies in conflict, but we are not barbarians. I am sorry you were taught to believe that we were." This conversation, relayed through the camp via Keiko, marked another shift. The women began to see their captors not just as individually kind, but as representatives of a different way of thinking about conflict, about enemies, about humanity. The gap between propaganda and reality had become too wide to ignore. Spring arrived in Arkansas with an explosion of green that astonished the Japanese women. Many had never experienced the dramatic seasonal changes of a continental climate. The garden plots that had been prepared in winter now burst into life, and the women who volunteered to work in them discovered a shared language with American personnel. Plants grow the same way regardless of nationality. The satisfaction of nurturing life is universal. Lieutenant O'Brien organized a small library in one of the common rooms, filling it with donated books, magazines, and newspapers. Some were in English, but she managed to acquire several books in Japanese through Red Cross channels. The women began to read American publications, seeing photographs of life in the United States, reading stories that bore no resemblance to what they had been taught about their enemy's society. Miyako wrote about looking at a magazine photograph of an American family at a picnic. The mother, father, and 3 children looked so ordinary, so normal, so similar to Japanese families she had known. She wrote, "They love their children the same way we do. They smile the same way. They worry about the same things. How did we become convinced they were fundamentally different from us?" In April, the Red Cross organized for some of the women to record brief messages that would be transmitted to their families in Japan. The process was carefully monitored, and the messages were limited to personal matters, but it was contact nonetheless. Haruko recorded a message for her sister in Kyoto, telling her simply, "I am alive. I am well. I am treated with respect. Do not worry for me." When Haruko's sister eventually received that message, months later, she reportedly broke down crying. She had been certain her sister was dead, and the idea that she was not only alive but being treated respectfully by American captors seemed impossible. The camp's daily shower schedule became more than just hygiene. It became a ritual of self-care, a moment of peace and warmth in uncertain times. The women no longer feared the water. They appreciated it. They sometimes lingered in the warmth, letting the tension flow away, allowing themselves to simply exist without constant vigilance. Lieutenant O'Brien noticed this change and mentioned it to Captain Harrison. The showers had become a symbol, she said. They represented the gap between expectation and reality, between propaganda and truth. Every day that hot water flowed was another day that proved the women's fears had been unfounded. In May, news reached the camp that the conflict in Europe had ended. The war in the Pacific continued, but everyone knew it could not last much longer. The Japanese women began to wonder what would happen to them when it all ended. Would they be returned to Japan? Would they be prosecuted for their service? Would they ever see their families again? Captain Harrison addressed these concerns honestly. He told them that he did not know what the future held, that decisions were being made at levels far above his authority, but that he would advocate for their fair treatment. He promised that whatever happened, their time at the camp would be documented, their cooperation noted, their dignity maintained. In August, the conflict ended with Japan's surrender. The women gathered around the radio in the common room, listening to the announcement. Hearing their emperor's voice for the first time as he addressed the nation, many wept. The weight of defeat, the magnitude of change, the uncertainty of what came next, all pressed down on them. But mixed with the grief was something unexpected: relief. Haruko spoke to Keiko that evening, and Keiko later shared the conversation with Lieutenant O'Brien. Haruko said that for years she had been carrying grief and rage, that she had expected to die in service to a cause she had believed was righteous. But her time in the camp had shown her that the world was more complicated than she had been taught. She no longer knew what to believe about the conflict, about right and wrong, about justice and honor. But she knew that she had been shown kindness when she expected cruelty, and that meant something. The process of repatriation took months. The women remained at the camp through the fall of 1945 and into early 1946. During this time, they were given opportunities to learn English, to study American culture, and to prepare for their return to a Japan that would be profoundly changed from the country they had left. Miyako used this time to fill journal after journal with her reflections. She wrote about how the experience had changed her understanding of humanity, of conflict, of the stories nations tell themselves about their enemies. She wrote about the hot showers, how something so simple had become so symbolically important. And she wrote about the American personnel she had come to know, not as abstractions or propaganda figures, but as individuals with their own stories and struggles. Before the women left, Captain Harrison organized a farewell gathering. It was informal, held in the common room, with simple refreshments and no particular agenda. He spoke briefly, through Keiko's translation, saying that he hoped the women would carry home a message about the possibility of dignity, even in difficult circumstances. He said that he had learned as much from them as he hoped they had learned from their time at the camp. Lieutenant O'Brien gave each woman a small gift, a bar of good soap wrapped in simple paper. It was practical and symbolic, a reminder of those daily showers that had meant so much. Many of the women cried as they accepted this small gesture, understanding everything it represented. When the women finally boarded trains to take them to the West Coast for transport back to Japan, they were profoundly different from the terrified prisoners who had arrived months earlier. They carried with them not just soap and memories, but a changed understanding of the world. Miyako's journals survived and were eventually published in Japan in the 1960s. They became an important document, offering a unique perspective on the conflict and its aftermath. She wrote in her final entry before leaving Arkansas, "We came here expecting death and found life. We expected cruelty and found kindness. We expected to be destroyed, and instead discovered that our enemies were capable of seeing us as human beings. I do not know how to reconcile this with everything I believed before, but I know that I will never forget the hot showers in Arkansas and what they taught me about the capacity for decency, even in the context of conflict." Keiko maintained correspondence with Captain Harrison for several years after the conflict. Their letters, preserved in archives, reveal a continued effort to understand each other's perspectives and to process the enormous changes that had swept through their world. In one letter from 1947, Keiko wrote that she had become a teacher in Tokyo and was working to promote international understanding. She credited her time at the camp with showing her that people were not defined by their nationality, but by their choices and actions. Haruko returned to Kyoto and lived quietly with her sister. She rarely spoke about her time as a prisoner, but when she did, she always mentioned the kindness shown to her by Lieutenant O'Brien. In a brief interview in the 1970s, shortly before her death, she said, "I went to that camp, believing I would die there. Instead, I learned that there were people on the other side who valued my life when I had stopped valuing it myself. That is a powerful thing to learn." The Jerome Relocation Center closed shortly after the last Japanese prisoners departed. The facility itself became a historical site, marked for its dual role in the conflict's history, first housing Japanese Americans displaced by their own government, then Japanese nationals captured in the Pacific. The story of the women and the hot showers became a footnote in histories, a small detail in an enormous conflict, but for those who lived it, it was transformative. Lieutenant O'Brien returned to nursing in Chicago after the conflict. She married, had 3 children, and worked in pediatric care for 40 years. In her retirement, she gave several interviews about her time at the camp. She said that working with the Japanese women had taught her about the power of simple kindness, about the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than as representatives of nations or ideologies. She kept a photograph of the farewell gathering on her desk until she died in 2003, a reminder of what human decency could accomplish even in the aftermath of global violence. Captain Harrison went on to a career in the State Department, working on reconstruction efforts in Japan, and later on international humanitarian law. He advocated throughout his life for the dignified treatment of all prisoners, arguing that how nations treat captured enemies reveals their true character. He cited his experience at the camp as foundational to his understanding of both human nature and international relations. The broader lesson of the camp took decades to fully emerge. In the immediate aftermath of the conflict, the story was largely unknown, overshadowed by larger narratives of victory and defeat, occupation and reconstruction. But as historians began to examine the smaller, more personal stories of the conflict, the tale of Japanese women being given hot showers in rural Arkansas emerged as a powerful example of humanity transcending hatred. What made the story particularly poignant was its simplicity. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic rescues, no cinematic moments of redemption. There were just daily showers with hot water, regular meals, warm blankets, and respectful treatment. But for women who had been conditioned to expect systematic abuse, these ordinary acts of decency were revolutionary. The hot showers became a metaphor in subsequent discussions of conflict and reconciliation. They represented the gap between propaganda and reality, between fear and experience, between what we are told about our enemies and what they actually are. They demonstrated that even in the context of global violence, individuals could choose dignity over cruelty, understanding over hatred. In 2015, the descendant of one of the camp's prisoners visited Arkansas. She brought with her copies of her grandmother's letters, written from the camp to family in Japan. In these letters, her grandmother had tried to describe the surreal experience of being treated well by her captors. The letters had been censored at the time, with certain passages blacked out, but enough remained to convey her wonder and confusion. The descendant donated copies to a historical archive and gave a brief talk at a local historical society. She spoke about how her grandmother had returned to Japan changed, how she had raised her children, including the visitor's father, with an emphasis on judging people as individuals rather than as members of groups. She spoke about how her grandmother had always kept a bar of good soap in a special place in her home, never using it, just keeping it as a reminder. And she spoke about how the story of the hot showers had been passed down through the generations as a lesson about the complexity of human nature. The historical record of the camp is now preserved in multiple archives. Miyako's journals, Keiko's correspondence with Captain Harrison, Lieutenant O'Brien's interviews, and official camp records all contribute to a comprehensive picture of this small but significant moment in history. Scholars have analyzed the camp as an example of effective humanitarian practice in prisoner management, as a case study in cross-cultural understanding, and as a counter-narrative to simplified stories of conflict and enmity. What emerges from these records is a story about the power of consistent, dignified treatment to transform fear into trust, suspicion into understanding, and hatred into recognition of shared humanity. The Japanese women who came to Arkansas expecting death and found hot showers instead carried that experience with them for the rest of their lives. They became ambassadors in their own quiet ways for the idea that enemies need not remain enemies, that understanding can emerge even from conflict, and that simple acts of decency matter more than grand gestures. The camp story also raises questions about the narratives nations construct during conflict. The Japanese women had been thoroughly convinced that American captivity would be brutal, because that is what they had been told repeatedly through official channels. The Americans had their own propaganda about Japanese enemies. Both sides had been taught to dehumanize the other. Yet when individuals from these opposed groups met in circumstances that allowed for actual interaction rather than violence, they discovered their common humanity. This is not to minimize the very real brutality that occurred in many places during the conflict, nor to suggest that all prisoner experiences were positive. They were not. Atrocities were committed by all sides. But the camp in Arkansas stands as proof that such brutality was not inevitable, that even in the context of global violence, choices could be made that honored human dignity. The hot showers, in the end, were just showers, but they became something more because of what they represented to women who had been taught to expect cruelty and found kindness instead. They became a symbol of the gap between propaganda and reality, a daily reminder that their enemies were capable of seeing them as human beings worthy of basic comfort and respect. In the decades since the conflict ended, as Japan and the United States transformed from enemies into allies, stories like that of the camp have become increasingly important. They provide counterweight to narratives of pure hostility, offering evidence that even during humanity's darkest moments, individuals could choose decency. They suggest that reconciliation is possible not because conflicts were not real or painful, but because underneath the national and ideological divisions, people remain fundamentally similar in their needs, hopes, and capacity for both cruelty and kindness. The women who experienced those hot showers in Arkansas carried that experience differently. Some, like Miyako, documented it extensively and made it part of their public legacy. Others, like Haruko, kept it more private, a personal transformation that shaped their later lives but was not widely shared. Still others processed it in ways that left little historical record but were no less profound for their privacy. What united them all was the recognition that they had experienced something unexpected, something that challenged their understanding of the world and their place in it. They had been prepared for death and received life. They had expected abuse and received respect. They had been certain of their enemy's cruelty and discovered their capacity for decency. And they had learned that hot water in a rural Arkansas camp could carry more meaning than the largest strategic victories or defeats. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.